Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore creativity. That topic was suggested by a viewer who goes by the name of Scott Sheffield. Basically, Scott has two principal questions. First, where does creativity come from? And then, what can we do, if anything, to foster and enhance its presence in our lives? In this particular video, we'll take up that first question, and we'll explore the second one in a separate video whose link I'll try to remember to include in the description section of this video. In any case, many thanks and a tip of the invisible chapeau to you, Scott Sheffield, for that great topic. Anyhow, here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video, and as usual you can find the same roadmap in the description section of this video along with links to the timestamps. So, like I was saying, the first part of Scott Sheffield's question has to do with where creativity comes from. And the answer to that question probably depends a lot on how we think about where everything else in the universe comes from. In the Western world, I'd say that there are two primary answers to that question. The first is theistic and religious, and the second is scientific. From a theistic perspective, creativity ultimately comes from God, because God is the original source of everything in existence, including the universe itself. Basically, God is the supreme creative being, the creator with a capital C, as he's often described in traditional Western theology. And our own human creativity is ultimately a reflection of God's creativity. That is, our human creativity is a tiny little spark of the divine that resides within us. One of the ways, actually, perhaps the most important way, that we were made in God's image. However, another way of looking at life, and hence at creativity, comes to us by way of the natural sciences. From that point of view, human creativity is like pretty much everything else in the universe, a phenomenon whose origin and nature are rationally comprehensible by way of empirical scientific investigation. So creativity would have as its origin the particular scientific principles that determine the unfolding of everything else in the universe, and hence the unfolding of everything human. For instance, at one level of description, human creativity comes from human biology, which we can explore by examining how our central nervous system functions. For instance, when we're engaged in creative activity. Or, at a somewhat more fundamental level of description, we can explore creativity by examining the patterns of neurotransmission that seem to influence it, which would basically be a way of exploring creativity by way of the principles of microbiology and biochemistry. And of course, all of that would be subtended by our more general scientific understanding of the principles of chemistry and ultimately physics. And of course, I guess we can always combine the theistic account with the scientific one and claim that God creates everything in the universe precisely by way of the scientific principles we can understand through empirical investigation. However, from my own perspective, there's a fundamental problem with relying too much on any of those sorts of perspectives to answer the question of the origin of creativity. And the problem is basically twofold. At a more superficial level, it has to do with something psychologists call confirmation bias, which in turn has to do with the very common human tendency to pay a lot more attention to information that seems to confirm our already existing biases, and a lot less attention to information that doesn't. As Simon and Garfunkel once succinctly put it, a man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. And so, if we really want to see everything in theistic terms, it's pretty easy to see the origin of creativity in terms of God, and our being made in the image of God. On the other hand, if we're inclined to see things from a more scientific perspective, we're probably going to see creativity in terms of the more general scientific account of the universe, and so on. But in either case, the answer to the question of the origin of creativity is really little more than a somewhat elaborate way of confirming our already existing biases and presuppositions about how everything works in the first place. In other words, the answer to the question really isn't an answer at all, but just an expression of how we want to see things. Of course, at that point, it's easy to wonder about what could possibly be the alternative. And in a way, that gets us to the second and more fundamental problem with the stock Western answers to the question of creativity. And it has to do with the presuppositions embedded within the question itself. And more specifically, the assumption that creativity has to have an origin in the first place. Of course, it's always tempting to suppose that creativity has to come from somewhere else because, well, because everything in the universe has to come from something else, right? Well, actually, says who? In fact, when you think about it, maybe the reason why it's so hard to find a definitive answer to the question of creativity has mostly to do with how we're conceiving, or more accurately, misconceiving of creativity in the first place, and hence the way we're formulating the question of its origin. In other words, maybe the way we're posing the question is what's making it impossible to answer, at least in any definitive and satisfying way. So, what might be a better way of thinking about creativity? One that wouldn't fall so easily into that kind of trap? Well, consider the possibility that what we call creativity isn't actually the product of some anterior set of factors or causes that bring it into existence, but a principle that runs through how things already are. You know, how everything in the universe is always moving past itself and transforming into something else, sometimes slowly and subtly, and sometimes suddenly and dramatically. And that would include every one of us, too. In other words, I'd like to suggest that creativity isn't like objects in the world that have origins, that come from somewhere else, but is actually an expression of the very principle of impermanence itself, which is something at the heart of all life and all the universe. From that point of view, the cosmos and everything in it, including us, is already giving way to something beyond itself, already giving birth and dying simultaneously, already creative in a sense. But maybe at this point, it's a little hard to see how that could possibly be true. So let me illustrate it with an observation that comes to us from the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus. He said rather famously, "You can't step into the same river twice." The reason for that is twofold. First, the river that you would step into for the second time is already a little bit different, at least a little bit. As you're stepping into it for the second time, the river's currents and tiny whirlpools are inevitably a little bit different from how they were a second or two ago. Maybe a frog has jumped into the river upstream before you can make your second step. Maybe the bubbles that were 3 meters away when you stepped for the first time are now only half a meter away. I think you get the picture. Basically, it's not the same river it was a moment ago. But the second reason why you can't step into the same river twice is that you yourself have changed, at least a little bit in the time between steps. For instance, your other foot is probably already wet from having taken your first step, which it wasn't during your first step. And even if you dry it off, well, now your second step is inevitably influenced by your having taken the time and energy to do that, which of course introduces another difference from your first step. In essence, you're a slightly different person after your first step, just as the river is a slightly different river. So from that point of view, creativity, that is, the production of something new that wasn't there before, isn't something that comes from somewhere. Rather, it's how everything is in the first place. It's how the universe is and how we ourselves are. In somewhat more poetically expressive terms, it's how the totality of existence is already breathing, already seething and ceaselessly transcending itself. And at the same time, creativity is how we ourselves are always participating in those dynamics of universal transcendence with everything we think and say and do, including making this video in this exact moment or listening to it again in this exact moment. In essence, we can't help but be creative. So from that perspective, the only real question is about the extent to which we'll be able to own the creativity that's already woven into our existence, whether we'll be able to lay claim to what we already are, and to ride its dizzying crest even more fully and more faithfully than we would otherwise. But if all of that's true, if creativity is really something like an ontological category, in other words, a fundamental dynamism running through all of life and the entirety of the universe, then the obvious question would be, well, then why is it that in terms of our actual experience, we don't feel particularly creative a lot of the time? Why does creativity so often seem elusive and fugitive to us? For instance, why is it that we're prone to experiencing things like writer's block or feeling like we're just plodding along in the ongoing humdrum grind of everyday life? And here, I think that one of the most incisive insights into the reality of human nature comes to us by way of Abraham Maslow's idea of the Jonah Complex. Basically, the Jonah Complex has to do with how we actively flee from our better talents and our deeper destinies in life, how we run from them more times than not. From Maslow's point of view, it's no accident that things like euphoric peak experiences and authentic self-actualization are relatively uncommon phenomena in this world. It's because most of us are doing everything in our power to keep them from happening in the first place. And so it is with creativity, which incidentally, Maslow identifies as one of the most important paths toward self-actualization. That is, toward fulfilling our unique constellations of potential and ultimately our distinct personal destinies. So from that point of view, the reason why we don't feel particularly creative a lot of the time is that we're simply running away from it in one form or another. And the ways we go about doing that can be pretty tricky and subtle, so much so that it can be a real challenge to recognize that it's actually happening. But then the question becomes, well, okay, but why would we do that? What motivation could we possibly have to renounce our fundamental creative birthright so often? Well, actually, when you think about it, we have plenty of motivation to do that. And a lot of it has to do with our fears. You know, all of the ghosts that haunt us in the midnight of our solitude and that ultimately keep us spiritually crippled and imprisoned in many areas of our lives, creativity being only one. So in essence, learning to follow a deeply creative path means facing our fears, refusing to be ruled by them and enslaved to them, and then learning to live with real courage. And that brings us to the edge of the second part of Scott Sheffield's original question, which we'll cover in the next video in this series. In that video, the central question will be, what are those sorts of fears, the kind that govern our personal Jonah complexes? And how can we learn to face them and then gradually move past them? And who knows, maybe eventually liberate our creative souls along the way. Basically, how can we find within ourselves what Rollo May calls the courage to create? Until then, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul, creative and otherwise.